October 24th, 2005, Ocilla, Georgia. A pristine white house sits locked under the heavy 80-degree sun. Inside, absolute silence. The doors are deadbolted. A car sits in the driveway, engine cold, but inches from the manicured front lawn, resting on dry pine needles, lies a single anomaly. An off-white, powdered latex glove. It smells faintly of chemical rubber, a stark contrast to the blooming sweet olive. This sterile barrier is the only flaw in a perfect scene. The woman who lived here is gone. She will not be seen again. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Ocilla, Georgia spans exactly 3.4 square miles. It is a quintessential southern enclave where the humidity hangs thick, often pushing past 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the late summer, and secrets are historically impossible to keep. With a population of barely 3,500 residents, the social ecosystem operates on absolute familiarity. Neighbors recognize the distinct sound of each other's vehicle engines. The congregation at the local church serves as the ultimate town square, and anonymity is nothing more than a myth. In a place this small, everyone knows your daily routine. At the absolute center of this tightly knit web was 30-year-old Tara Grinstead. She was not merely a resident, she was a local institution. Born with an intense internal drive for excellence, Tara navigated a life defined by a fascinating, almost cinematic duality. To the casual observer, she was the ultimate portrait of Southern grace. As a former Miss Tifton who had graced the stage competing for the highly coveted title of Miss Georgia, she possessed a practiced poise. Her appearance was always immaculate, perfectly styled hair, tailored clothes, and a radiant, camera-ready exterior. Yet the rhinestone crowns and evening gowns were only a fraction of her identity. Behind the glamorous veneer was a fiercely dedicated, highly independent intellectual. Tara spent her days navigating the cinderblock hallways of Irwin County High School. As an 11th grade history teacher, she traded the spotlight for chalkboard dust and the heavy responsibility of shaping young minds. She was not an educator who simply clocked in and out. She demanded excellence, running a strict but deeply empathetic classroom. Her psychological makeup was rooted in constant self-improvement. Tara was actively pursuing her doctorate in education, spending her quiet evenings poring over dense academic texts under the warm glow of her living room lamps. She wanted to eventually step into an administrative role to actively reshape the educational landscape of her rural district. Furthermore, Tara weaponized her pageant experience for the benefit of the next generation. She spent countless weekends mentoring local teenage girls, teaching them interview skills, posture, and public speaking. She offered them a blueprint for building self-worth in a county where outside opportunities could feel painfully scarce. She was the woman young girls aspired to become, and the teacher parents trusted implicitly. Her sanctuary from this relentless schedule was a historic single-story house on West Park Street. The property was a direct reflection of her disciplined mind, meticulously maintained, beautifully decorated, and secure. She lived alone, sharing the space only with her beloved dog, Hermann. The German Shepherd mix provided both fierce companionship and a comforting layer of security for a single woman building a life on her own terms. In a town where time often felt like it moved at the slow, deliberate pace of a dripping faucet, Tara Grinstead was a force in constant motion. Her upward trajectory was obvious to everyone who crossed her path. She was constructing a substantial, unshakable future. And it is precisely this vibrant, heavily documented, and highly visible life that makes her sudden, total evaporation so entirely incomprehensible. A woman so deeply anchored to her community. A woman who meticulously plans her week down to the hour. Does not simply walk out the door and disappear. Irwin County High School is the undisputed nerve center of the region. In rural districts spanning miles of agricultural space, the local educational facility serves as much more than a place of learning. It is the social, cultural, and athletic pulse of the entire community. The building itself is a standard mid-century structure, long corridors lined with battered metal lockers, cold cinder block walls painted in institutional colors, and the permanent scent of industrial floor wax masking the heavy humidity that seeps in from the Georgia clay outside. For the teenagers navigating those halls, the social hierarchy is absolute. Status is dictated by football jerseys, family lineage, and proximity to the agricultural wealth that surrounds the town. Within this intense microcosm, the history teacher held a unique and highly respected position. Her classroom was a strictly controlled environment. She enforced rigid academic standards, requiring her students to actively engage with the material rather than simply memorize dates. Yet, despite her demanding syllabus, her room was considered a sanctuary. She understood the specific pressures of growing up in a geographically isolated area. She listened to her students' frustrations, offering guidance on college applications, career paths, and life beyond the county lines. However, she maintained an impenetrable professional boundary. She was a mentor, never a peer. Her authority was never questioned, largely because she projected an aura of complete self-assurance. To comprehend the fracture that was about to occur, one must understand the specific demographic divide within the school's alumni. Every graduating class in a town this size produces two distinct types of young adults. There are those who use their diplomas as a stepping stone to leave, or to build substantial, respectable lives locally. And there are those who remain tethered to the town, slowly sinking into a stagnant routine of low-wage labor, substance abuse, and fading high school glory. Graduating 3 years prior to the incident, the class of 2002 included two young men who represented the latter category, though they originated from vastly different backgrounds. The first was Bo Dukes. In this region, the Dukes name carried significant economic weight. His family owned a sprawling, highly profitable pecan orchard just outside the city limits. Bo grew up with the distinct privilege that accompanies land ownership in the Deep South. He navigated his teenage years with a potent blend of charm and arrogance. A young man accustomed to having his transgressions quietly smoothed over by family influence. He was loud, charismatic, and heavily entitled. Following graduation, he enlisted in the military, a path that briefly suggested a turn toward discipline. But his service was marred by misconduct, leading to an eventual discharge that sent him right back to his hometown. He returned not as a humbled veteran, but as a restless, volatile presence. Someone who viewed local laws and social norms as suggestions rather than hard rules. The second figure was Ryan Duke. Despite sharing a phonetically identical last name, Ryan was not related to Bo. Furthermore, their social standings were entirely opposite. Ryan grew up in a fractured home environment, completely devoid of the financial safety nets that caught Bo every time he fell. In high school, Ryan was a relatively capable athlete. He played on the tennis team and possessed a quiet, unassuming physical strength, but he was fundamentally a follower. He lacked the aggressive charisma of his peers, preferring to blend into the background to avoid conflict. As the years passed after graduation, Ryan's trajectory angled sharply downward. He succumbed to severe substance abuse, developing dependencies that further eroded his ambition and his physical health. He became a passive vessel, a quiet, compliant shadow, trailing behind louder, more dominant personalities. These two young men forged an unlikely but deeply toxic codependency. Bo provided the transportation, the resources, and the chaotic energy. Ryan provided an audience and an absolute lack of resistance. They spent their days drifting through the county, drinking heavily, consuming narcotics, and cruising the empty rural highways in an old white pickup truck. Their connection to the history teacher was minimal but verified. Both had sat in her classroom. She had graded their papers, monitored their exams, and likely recognized the vast differences in their potential. But by the fall of 2005, they were merely ghosts from her professional past. She was hyper-focused on her doctoral studies and her upwardly mobile career. They were completely consumed by their next high. There was absolutely no logical reason for their worlds to intersect again. They existed in completely separate stratospheres of the local ecosystem. She represented discipline, beauty, and ambition. They represented the darkest, most stagnant corners of the county. Yet, in a town measuring barely 3 square miles, physical proximity often overrides social distance. The heavy air of the region held a creeping desperation. a tension fueled by the sprawling, silent pecan orchards that bordered the town. Those orchards, characterized by perfectly straight rows of towering trees and soft, sandy soil, were completely isolated. At night, they offered absolute darkness and total secrecy. Saturday, October 22nd, 2005, brought a heavy, stagnant heat to the region. The humidity clung to the pavement, amplifying the scent of fried dough, roasting sugar, and diesel exhaust. It was the weekend of the annual Sweet Potato Festival, an event that temporarily swelled the local population and completely disrupted the usual quiet rhythm of the county. The streets were choked with slow-moving pickup trucks and pedestrians. For Tara, this was not a day of leisure. It was a day of intense, highly visible social obligation. She spent the daylight hours immersed in the chaotic energy of the local beauty pageant, utilizing her extensive background to manage the contestants. The environment inside the auditorium was stifling, a dizzying mix of aerosol hairspray, nervous adrenaline, and the glare of stage lighting. Tara operated with her signature precision, adjusting evening gowns, offering technical advice on walking postures, and keeping the schedule moving. It was exhausting, highly social labor. By the time the crowns were awarded and the auditorium began to empty into the warm evening air, she had been on her feet for nearly 12 hours. Seeking a brief decompression, Tara drove to a relaxed barbecue hosted by a former school superintendent. The gathering was small, consisting of colleagues and close acquaintances. The atmosphere was a stark contrast to the high-voltage energy of the pageant. She ate a light meal, engaged in casual professional conversation, and finally allowed her rigid posture to relax. As the clock approached 11 p.m., she signaled her departure. She politely informed her hosts that her exhaustion had peaked and she desperately needed to return home to sleep. She walked out to her vehicle, the gravel crunching under her tires as she backed out of the driveway. The drive to West Park Street was incredibly brief, barely a few miles of empty, dark residential roads. Upon arriving home, the transition from public figure to private individual began. The house was quiet. The German Shepherd mix greeted her at the door. Tara went through her evening routine. She removed the heavy stage makeup, took off her jewelry, and changed into comfortable sleepwear. The doors were secured, the exterior lights were extinguished. The air conditioning hummed a low, mechanical rhythm against the southern heat. She laid down, expecting the deep, dreamless sleep of the entirely exhausted. Miles away, the night was operating on a distinctly different frequency. Ryan Duke was completely consumed by chemical dependency. The craving for narcotics had overridden any remaining sense of logic or self-preservation. He needed cash, and he needed it immediately. He was completely out of resources, out of favors, and desperate. His physical state was deteriorating, muscle tremors, a racing heart, the sickening cold sweat of impending withdrawal. In this state of singular, blinding need, he began to wander the dark residential streets. He was not looking for a specific target. He was hunting for an opportunity. A house that looked vulnerable, a vehicle with an unlocked door. He eventually found himself on West Park Street. The historic single-story house sat in complete darkness. To Ryan's drug-addled mind, it simply represented a quiet, isolated structure, a place where a purse might be resting on a kitchen counter, a place where a few $100s could be quietly extracted while the occupants slept. He approached the property, his boots sinking silently into the dry pine needles covering the yard. He moved to the rear of the house. The security protocols that Tara usually maintained were comprehensive. But in a town of 3 square miles, a single overlooked detail is all it takes. He found a point of entry, a door that yielded. He slipped inside. The transition from the humid outdoor air to the cool, dark interior was jarring. He stood perfectly still, letting his eyes adjust to the heavy shadows. The house was dead silent, save for the hum of the appliances. He began to move through the rooms, stepping carefully to avoid creaking floorboards. He was not a hardened, tactical criminal. He was a trembling addict acting on raw impulse. Then, the silence broke. Tara woke up. The exact sensory trigger remains known only to her. A shadow crossing the ambient light of the window, a scuffling sound on the hardwood floor, or the sudden, terrifying realization of a foreign presence in her sanctuary. She did not freeze, she reacted. The low-tension atmosphere shattered instantly. He panicked. She fought back. Adrenaline flooded his system. He lunged. The struggle was sudden, uncoordinated, and violently physical. He was cornered, terrified of being caught, terrified of this strong, athletic woman who was actively fighting for her life in the dark. He struck her. The impact was heavy. She fell back. The fight ended as abruptly as it began. Ryan stood over her in the crushing silence of the bedroom. His breathing was ragged, catching in his throat. He waited for her to move. She did not. The reality of the situation rapidly crushed the haze of his withdrawal. He had not found cash. He had committed murder. Blind panic took control. He could not leave her there. The instinct to erase the massive mistake overrode everything else. He needed to get her out of the house. His hands shook violently as he grabbed a quilt from the bed. He wrapped her body in the heavy fabric, struggling under the dead weight. Every sound in the house now felt like an alarm. The dog barked, a sharp, confused sound. But Ryan ignored it. His focus entirely narrowed on the logistics of removal. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of latex gloves. He snapped them onto his sweating hands, a sudden, desperate attempt to prevent leaving fingerprints on the doors or the fabric. He gripped the heavy quilt and began pulling. He dragged the bundle down the hallway, out the door, into the oppressive heat of the Georgia night. As he heaved the weight toward the driveway, the quilt snagged. He adjusted his grip. In the frantic, clumsy motion, the friction pulled at his right hand. The latex glove slipped from his sweaty skin. It fell away, landing softly on the bed of dry pine needles near the manicured front lawn. He didn't notice. He loaded the body into the vehicle. The metal doors slammed shut, a dull thud echoing into the empty street. Ryan got behind the wheel. His mind immediately jumped to the only person he knew who had the resources, the geographical knowledge, and the complete lack of moral boundaries required to make this disappear. He pointed the vehicle away from the city limits. He drove straight toward the deep, sprawling isolation of the Hudson Pecan Orchard. October 24th, 2005. Monday morning at Irwin County High School began with rigid predictability. The 8 a.m. bell echoed through the cinderblock hallways. Lockers slammed shut. Students filed into their assigned seats. But room 612 remained entirely empty. No lights, no lesson plans on the chalkboard. For any other educator, a delayed arrival might prompt a casual phone call to the front office. For the 11th grade history teacher, an unexcused absence was a massive, immediate red flag. She had never missed a single day without meticulous prior coordination. By 8:30 a.m., minor administrative annoyance shifted into genuine, rising concern. Faculty members attempted to reach her mobile device. The calls routed straight to voicemail. By 8:50 a.m., local law enforcement was dispatched to West Park Street to conduct a standard welfare check. The arriving patrol officers found the property locked in a state of eerie, sterile preservation. The pearl-white Mitsubishi Eclipse sat angled in the driveway. The engine block was entirely cold to the touch. Oddly, the vehicle was unlocked. A crisp $100 bill rested plainly visible in the center console. There were thick streaks of red Georgia clay clinging to the tires, a distinct, glaring contrast to the paved residential roads of her usual weekend route. Officers knocked heavily on the front door. The only response was the frantic, isolated barking of the German Shepherd mix inside. Protocol was bypassed. The officers circumvented the deadbolts and breached the residence. The interior atmosphere was jarringly cold. The central air conditioning was running at maximum capacity, fighting the heavy morning humidity seeping through the window panes. Nothing appeared visibly ransacked. The hardwood floors were clean. The living room furniture was perfectly aligned. Her mobile phone was plugged into the wall, actively drawing a charge on the bedroom nightstand. A single set of clothes, the casual wear she likely wore the previous day, was draped neatly over a chair. Her beloved dog paced nervously, highly distressed by the isolation. But crucial, everyday items were completely missing. Her purse, her vehicle keys, the house keys. The environment presented a massive logical contradiction. The locked doors and the charging phone suggested a resident who had settled in for the quiet night. The missing purse and keys indicated someone who had left intentionally. yet her car was still sitting in the driveway. A highly visible local figure walking out into the heavy darkness of rural Georgia on foot, leaving behind her transportation and her communication device, defied every established pattern of her heavily documented existence. Crime scene technicians from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation soon arrived to replace the local patrolman. The property transitioned instantly from a private sanctuary into a forensic grid. Technicians dusted the doorframes for latent prints. They processed the scene with intense scrutiny, securing the perimeter with yellow tape. The dog was handed over to a neighbor. News of the empty house spread through the 3-square-mile town with the speed of a lit fuse. Within hours, the localized concern mutated into a massive, county-wide mobilization. This was not a fractured community waiting passively for federal intervention. Ocilla possessed a deep, agrarian self-reliance. By Tuesday morning, an ad hoc command center was erected in the town center. Hundreds of civilian volunteers abandoned their shifts at the local agricultural processing plants and farming supply stores to join the organized grid searches. The geographical reality of Irwin County presents a logistical nightmare for a tactical recovery operation. The terrain is a vast, suffocating expanse of dense pine forests, sprawling agricultural fields, and deep, stagnant swamp water. The heat index pushed past 85 degrees Fahrenheit, baking the search grids and exhausting the volunteers. The air was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust from portable generators and the relentless hum of insects. Men on horseback rode through the impenetrable brush. ATVs carved muddy paths through the thick undergrowth. Civilian helicopters and low-flying crop dusters scoured the county from the air, looking for disturbed earth, vulture activity, or discarded clothing. Local hunters, intimately familiar with the backwoods topography, led trained tracking dogs through miles of wet ravines. The search lines moved shoulder to shoulder, rhythmically beating the tall, dry grass with heavy walking sticks. They dragged the dark waters of the Yalapaha River. They systematically drained isolated agricultural ponds. They inspected hundreds of abandoned barns, rusted grain silos, and decaying hunting blinds scattered across the rural landscape. Despite the unprecedented volume of human capital deployed, the physical yield was absolutely zero. No purse, no keys, no torn fabric. The environment had simply swallowed her whole. As the first week bled into the second, the adrenaline of the initial search faded into a heavy, creeping paranoia. The psychological echo of the disappearance fundamentally altered the social fabric of Ocilla. The absolute lack of a forced entry or a bloody crime scene meant the threat was entirely formless. It meant the perpetrator was likely someone operating within their own borders. Someone who knew the town. Someone who knew her. Residents who had never locked their doors in decades suddenly drove to the hardware store to purchase heavy deadbolts and exterior floodlights. The hardware aisles were systematically emptied of ammunition. Trust evaporated completely. Every passing pickup truck was scrutinized. Every neighbor with a fresh scratch on their arm or a slightly inconsistent timeline was subjected to quiet, vicious rumors at the local diner. The community had successfully scoured hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain. They had printed tens of thousands of flyers. They had raised a massive financial reward through local donations. Yet, they were essentially fighting a ghost. The ambitious history teacher had vanished from a secure house, leaving behind a desperately searching town and an official investigation that was about to hit a massive, decade-long wall. The only physical anchor the authorities possessed was the sterile latex glove discarded in the front yard. Crime lab technicians successfully extracted a male DNA profile from the inside of the rubber material. This should have been the key to an immediate resolution. However, when the genetic sequence was run through the National CODIS database, the system returned 0 matches. The perpetrator was a ghost. Desperate, agents began systematically swabbing the cheeks of dozens of local men, demanding DNA samples from anyone who had ever interacted with the victim. This analytical sweep rapidly produced 2 highly visible red herrings. The first was a former romantic partner. He was a local law enforcement officer who had recently returned from a military deployment overseas. Their relationship had been long-term but highly volatile, officially severing mere months before the incident. The friction of their breakup was heavily documented. Consequently, he became the immediate target for public suspicion. Investigators interrogated him repeatedly, searching for any microscopic fracture in his narrative. He maintained absolute innocence, providing a rigid alibi that placed him miles away, surrounded by verified witnesses, during the critical window of the abduction. Despite the heavy cloud of local rumor, forensic analysis of his vehicle yielded zero physical ties. His DNA did not match the glove. The second shadow fell on a married police officer from a neighboring jurisdiction. Phone records indicated a high volume of communication between him and the history teacher, including calls placed on the very Sunday she went missing. He ultimately admitted to leaving a business card tightly wedged in her front door that weekend. This revelation threatened to permanently fracture his personal life. The GBI pressed him hard, operating under the theory that a hidden, illicit romance might have escalated into sudden violence. However, his alibi proved completely impenetrable. He had simply been attempting to check on her welfare after she missed a social engagement. His DNA was also a negative match. These intensely focused avenues of inquiry ultimately resulted in total dead ends. The investigators were chasing phantoms through the Georgia clay. Years began to bleed into a full decade. The massive financial reward fund sat completely untouched. The missing posters taped to the windows of the local hardware store faded under the punishing southern sun. The case file ballooned, becoming the largest in the entire history of the state's investigative bureau. It contained thousands of interviews and completely empty leads. Oscilla learned to live with the permanent trauma. The empty house on West Park Street was eventually sold. The community stopped conducting grid searches and accepted the suffocating mystery. The total stagnation held firm until late 2016. At this juncture, the digital era forced a massive, uninvited spotlight back onto the 3-square-mile town. Independent media, specifically a highly produced, serialized audio documentary, arrived in Irwin County. The creator began knocking on doors, re-interviewing old witnesses, and broadcasting the town's darkest secret to a global audience of millions. The pressure generated by this renewed scrutiny was immense. The local authorities were forced to establish a dedicated tip line. The intense public pressure acted as a massive psychological catalyst. The sheer volume of attention began to crack the rigid silence of the local underworld. The breakthrough was not born from a brilliant forensic maneuver. It was born from a failure of nerve. In early 2017, the GBI received a tip that radically altered the entire trajectory of the 12-year investigation. A young woman stepped forward, carrying a massive psychological burden. She informed the authorities that her current romantic partner, the volatile pecan orchard heir, Bo Dukes, had confessed a horrific secret to her. According to her statement, Bo had told her that back in 2005, his former high school associate, Ryan Duke, had broken into the teacher's home to steal money for narcotics. The burglary went violently wrong. Ryan had strangled the homeowner, loaded her into his vehicle, and driven her to the isolated property owned by Bo's family. The informant stated that Bo had been enlisted not to commit the murder, but to completely destroy the evidence. For the investigators, the names were jarring. Ryan Duke and Bo Dukes had never been on the primary radar. They were peripheral figures, entirely disconnected from the victim's ambitious social circle. Crucially, because Ryan had never been arrested for a felony, his DNA had never entered the national database to trigger a match with the glove. The GBI moved with immediate, lethal precision. The 12-year grace period was over. Agents located Ryan and brought him into the interrogation room. The man who sat across the table was a hollow shell, physically and mentally degraded by years of severe substance abuse. He did not possess the psychological fortitude to maintain a decade-old lie. Under the focused pressure of the interrogation, the facade crumbled almost instantly. He confessed. He detailed the desperate need for drug money, the impromptu decision to target the dark house, the chaotic struggle, and the terrifying realization of what he had done. He confirmed the location of the disposal. Most importantly, he admitted that the sterile latex glove found in the front yard belonged to him. It had slipped from his sweating hand in a blind panic as he dragged the heavy quilt across the lawn. A simple cheek swab finally provided the exact DNA match the GBI had sought for over 4,000 days. The focus then shifted aggressively to Bo Dukes. While Ryan had committed the initial violence, Bo was the architect of the absolute erasure. Ryan confessed that they had taken the body deep into the Hudson pecan orchard. There, they had built a massive fire. They maintained the blaze for days, completely incinerating the remains until absolutely nothing recognizable was left in the ash. The decade of frustration shattered in a matter of hours. The untouchable phantoms were gone, replaced by two deeply flawed men who had hidden in plain sight, carrying the weight of a horrific secret while the entire town tore itself apart looking for answers. The swift arrests permanently fractured the men's toxic codependency. Inside the courthouse, their unified front collapsed into a bitter, high-stakes game of mutual betrayal. Bo Dukes faced a jury first in 2019. The state did not pursue him for the initial violence, but rather the calculated destruction of a human being. The prosecution detailed how he utilized his family's isolated property to orchestrate a fire so intense it reduced the victim to microscopic bone fragments. The jury convicted him on all counts, yielding a 25-year prison sentence. 3 years later, the primary aggressor finally stood trial. By 2022, his narrative had completely inverted. He testified under oath that his initial confession was entirely fabricated under the crushing weight of drug withdrawal and fear. He attempted to hurl the entirety of the murder charge onto his incarcerated former friend, claiming his only role was moving the body after the fact. The jury's verdict reflected the convoluted reality of the decayed evidence. They acquitted him of malice murder, finding him guilty only of concealing a death. He received a maximum 10-year sentence, a staggering, hollow conclusion for a town that had waited 17 years for absolute justice. The local community eventually returned to its quiet daily rhythms, but the fundamental trust that once defined the area never fully recovered. The sprawling agricultural land where the destruction occurred still stands just outside the borders, silent and imposing. In the heavy heat of the southern summer, the long, uniform rows of trees cast deep shadows across the sandy dirt. They serve as a permanent, living monument to a profound fracture. A brilliant mentor driven by relentless ambition was systematically erased in the dark, leaving an entire county forever altered by a horrific truth that had been hiding in plain sight for over 4,000 days. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.